To order. Welcome to meeting number 87 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. In accordance with our routine motion, I am informing the committee that all remote participants have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 106 Sub 4, the committee is meeting to consider a request by members of the committee to undertake a study concerning a Public Health Agency of Canada contract. The floor is open. Dr. Ellis.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for everybody being here this morning. This is an exceedingly important time in Canadian history when we begin to look at the spending of this Liberal government in cahoots with the NDP. You know, we know very clearly that Canadians have had a significant difficulty with the reckless spending of this Liberal NDP coalition government. And we also know very clearly that Tiff Macklin, the governor of the Bank of Canada, has said that domestic inflation is related to this government pouring their inflationary spending fuel on a fire. And we know also very clearly that Canadians are paying the price for that. We know that the cost of housing in this country has doubled. We know that interest rates have gone up quicker than any time in history. We know that inflation is at a 40-year high. We know that Canadians cannot heat their homes, feed their families, and keep a roof over their heads. And we also know very clearly from conversations with those very, very important people that we represent that this is not going to change. Because this Liberal NDP government continues to do its dirty deeds with respect to inflationary spending. We hear from the people we represent every single day, Mr. Chair, and I know that you do too in PEI, that you hear from them telling you exactly how difficult it is to pay their bills. And I know that those other members sitting across from me hear from the people that they represent in this great nation as well. And when we also know that the visits to food banks are at an all-time high, we know that millions upon millions upon millions of people are visiting food banks every single month. We know that in the small town where I live, in Truro, Nova Scotia, that they have 1,800 people on their list who come to the food bank regularly. Things have gotten so bad. When I spoke to the mayor of the county of Colchester on Friday, that the food bank has reached out to the county now to ask them to pay their mortgage, that they continue to have to buy more food and figure out ways to feed the 1,800 people, including children, Mr. Chair, who are on their list. Now, the reason we're here, of course, is the spending of $150 million by this government on a failed business plan with Medicago. But we also know that realistically, the business dealings with this company, it's actually over $300 million because they originally spent $172 million for infrastructure and building, et cetera. And then they entered into contracts with this company for another $150 million. So talk about throwing bad money after good, potentially, or just more bad money after bad money. Chair, we also know very clearly that in 2003, Canada was one of the signatories of a WHO framework, the Convention on Tobacco Control, which made it very clearly in this document, Chair, as they call it at WHO, the FCTC, very clearly that Canada was one of the signatories on this, which also this government should have known that when they were part of a company with Philip Morris International, a tobacco company, that there was no way that this vaccine was going to be accepted. And therefore, of course, what did they do? They continued to spend more money. And we also know very clearly that they've spent money on a multitude of other examples. The ArriveCAN app, colloquially known as the Arrive Scam app, which when you watch some of the testimony that's happening at the current time with respect to that particular app, that it appears to me now, you know what, I've obviously never developed an app, and I don't really know that much about it, but it appears to be two guys in their basement who didn't even develop an app, but acted as intermediaries and took a lot of money, $54 million from this Liberal NDP coalition, and then farmed it out to some other people, which we now know very clearly from the media stories that have come out, that it was possible to develop this app in a weekend. It was that simple to actually do. And therefore, when all of this comes out, we know that some people got very rich in doing this. And again, it's an absolute travesty, I would suggest.
Order from Ms. Sidhu.
Is that relevant to today's, what Mr. Ellis is doing?
What I would say is that there's no motion in front of the committee at this time, but the agenda is to consider a request to undertake a study concerning Public Health Agency of Canada. The letter that compelled this meeting does refer to lost funds, and I would say that Dr. Ellis's comments are connected to that concept, so I'm not convinced that there is an issue of relevance here. Go ahead, Dr. Ellis.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And oddly enough, doesn't it make perfect sense that our Liberal colleagues don't want us talking about these painful issues? And I think that we've established this very clearly in this committee previously. When those things come up that are difficult and hard and painful, we continue to get these interruptions over and over and over again. We saw that when we wanted to bring forward a study on opioids, Chair, when we got interrupted over and over again asking about the relevance of it. And of course, we do know very clearly that housing and poverty are associated with opioid use and misuse from this government actually now giving away powerful opioids to Canadians, which are being sold on the street and diverted in terms of their use. Chair, I would say I am digressing a bit, and I shall return to the actual motion. You know, when we look at this, again, this is $300 million now that we're talking about. And when we look at, you know, other scandals that have been involved, that this government, this NDP Liberal coalition government has been involved in, we know that this is a usual thing for them now. You know, the only thing, of course, perhaps that is more expensive is the Trans Mountain Pipeline cost overruns, which were at $30.9 billion, and I'll direct people to a Global News article with respect to that. So, I mean, obviously that's in a different category, but you know what, Chair, I would suggest that the difficulty here is that many Canadians are so used to hearing these scandals and lack of fiscal responsibility. I'll say that again, yes, lack of fiscal responsibility, that they perhaps don't understand or don't want to realize or get numb. I think that's the better wording, Chair, is that they get numb to the fact that this is $300 million, which of course is a third of $1 billion with a B dollars, which is incredible, absolutely incredible amount of money. Therefore, Chair, the Conservatives believe that it's important that we study this issue. And therefore, Chair, I would like to move the following motion, and I'll read it in English, and there are copies available, and I think that we can circulate those, that given recent media reports that the Public Health Agency of Canada lost over $300 million on an unfulfilled contract, the committee undertake a study of the Public Health Agency of Canada losing over $300 million in taxpayers' money for an unfulfilled contract. The committee holds 6 hours of meetings on this matter, and that each current meeting of the Health Committee is expanded by 1 hour to address this matter, and that the committee hear from the Minister of Health, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, President of the Public Health Agency of Canada, the President of the Treasury Board, and officials from the Health Ministry, and other witnesses deemed relevant by the committee, and that the hearing begin at the next available meeting, and that the committee produce a report on its finding and report it to the House. Chair, I would suggest, one of the other things that I think is relevant to point out is when you look at the Public Accounts of Canada 2023, of which I have a giant copy here on my desk, this is 3 volumes. And when you look at through this massive tome of where this possibly could end up, and on volume 3, it's on page 143. And, I don't know what the font is, but I would suggest it might be 6, it might be 8. Under this line on page 143 of volume 3, what does it say? It says, in incredibly ridiculous terms, unfulfilled contract by a vendor, amount of loss, $150 million, amount not expected to be recovered, $150 million. Shameful. I mean, when you think about it, when you look at this giant encyclopedic tome and you understand that this government thinks that the accountability for Canada is related to the fact that they can bury this 2/3 of the way through a 4-inch document printed on 2 sides, that's an acceptable way to do business on behalf of Canadians. This Liberal NDP coalition tried to hide at least that $150 million. And again, why do I say it's over $300 million that this coalition has lost? As I said previously, they also invested in this company, which they knew was going to produce something that could never be used, even though their nefarious purpose was to attempt to take this vaccine and shove it into the COVAX program after they had already taken vaccines out of that, which is the only G7 country to have done so. That's a whole entirely other shady story, Chair. But I do believe that Canadians deserve and demand an explanation for how they believe that they could possibly bury, hide, and lose $300 million in taxpayer money. So asking this committee to study this and attempting to be generous with how we might all spend our time doing this, this is exceedingly important, and therefore, Chair, the Conservatives move that we here in Health Committee start a study on this, calling those witnesses, as we mentioned in the motion, and taking a minimum of 6 hours of time here, such that the committee needs to study this on behalf of Canadians. So, Chair, I will leave it at that. I'm sure I'll have much other things to say later, and then just want to make sure I'm back on the list to come back to, Chair. But I believe the motion is order and would like to hear comments on that. Thank you.
The motion is in order. I recognize Mr. Doherty.
If I might, Mr. Casey, can I cede a portion of my time to Mr. Paul Hughes, and he could cede the floor back to me? Is that allowed?
He is actually number 4 on the list. So after you is Dr. Kitchen and then Mr. Paul Hoos.
I'll let Mr. Paul Hughes go first.
Okay. So you want to cede your time to Mr. Paul Hoos?
And we'll just switch if we can.
Can they do that?
Are we allowed to do that?
Yeah, I'm advised that is possible. So we have Mr. Paul Hoos, then Dr. Kitchen, then Mr. Doherty, and then Mr. Joe Harry. And there are more.
Sorry, Mr. Point of Order.
Please.
Did you just permit a switching of speakers? Is that permitted?
I did after getting advice from the clerk, yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Mr. Paul Hoos.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm here this morning in particular because there's a geographical interest with regard to Medicago that was in Quebec City, my city. And secondly, we've dealing with the pandemic file for a number of years. And let's remember that when the contract was given to Frank Davis, $137 million to respiratory devices, $37 million. I'd like to ask why we paid $100 million more for devices that were only a few hundred that were produced during the contract. But with regard to the management of contracts and public funds, during the pandemic, there were expenses that were necessary. We all know that. And with the parliamentary budget officer said that there some $300 billion that could be explained, and then another $200 billion that were difficult to explain what they were used for. And we have contracts, for example, with Belize. We had money that was used for Medicago, and last February the business decided to close down, and we were surprised that more than $100 million were spent by the federal government, and there didn't seem to be any oversight. And the government of Quebec also loaned money to the business, and so this money seems to have been lost as well. And in addition, we find that Health Canada was, since it was part of Philip Morris, should not have been receiving any funding. And then we've learned that another $150 million was lost for Medicago. So we're now up to about $300 million as far as we know. And this is a major problem, Chair, because we only read about this on a few lines in the document that my colleague pointed out. No explanations, and at first it was 150 million, and there were very real needs during the pandemic. But how this money was used, I mean, there has to be an accounting. And the almost 150, now it's up to almost the double, 300 in Quebec. This is just a business that's now closed, people that are out of work. And the minister says, we're trying to find a problem, solve the problems or find some solution. And all we hear from the Liberals are we're looking for a solution. We're working on the problem. And so there's $300 million lost, no explanation. And so I think this is an urgent issue. And I believe that the Health Committee is responsible for authorizing spending. And this is a file that's directly related to Health Canada and our work in the committee. And I think that we don't really know where this money was lost, what was it used for. And so, Chair, I think this is a very good idea. We have to get answers. I mean, transparency. It's not for the Conservative Party or the Bloc Québécois or for the NPD. It's for NDP. That's for the Canadians. They're the ones that have been paying. Money has been spent or distributed, and we don't know how or why. And so the company gets $300 million, then they go back to Japan. And the government says, oh, well, too bad. Doesn't matter. No, we think it's really serious. And I think there are limits to what we can accept, things that are unacceptable. And I think this motion is very important. And I think that we have the Conservatives and the Bloc are in favor, and I hope the NDP as well. And I think there are answers. We have to get answers to why the taxpayers' money is being spent this way. Thank you.
Paulus, next Dr. Kitchen, and then Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this motion. You know, it's interesting. There seems to be such a huge lack of concern by this NDP Liberal government on $150 million. It's just shocking that they think that $150 million is chump change. The average Canadian that's out there, and I say even more than the average Canadian, sit and talk about nickels and dimes. My wife and I have talked about nickels and dimes for years. And continually we talk, and around the household, when we look at families, they talk about where are those nickels and those dimes going to come from. And they add up, and you continually add them up. And here we have a government that turns around and, you know, when they used to talk about thousands of dollars, they consider thousands of dollars now nickels. And now they're talking millions of dollars. And they still think they're just dimes. Well, we're talking $150 million that is being out there, that is being wasted and not being accounted for by this government. And that's shocking when we have Canadians that are suffering and struggling to make ends meet and to get by day after day with the huge inflationary costs that this government keeps causing with their economic strategy that just drives up cost after cost. And here we have $150 million that go a tremendous way in helping Canadians. You take a look at Coronach, Saskatchewan, where this government has been trying to end the use of coal energy and shutting down a community. $150 million in that community would go tremendously to assist these people and to help them get out of this mess that they're in because of what this government's doing. Yet $150 and they just turn around and think it's nothing. And that's shocking that they can actually think about along those ways. You know, you take that $150 million and then add to it the $172 million in infrastructure for a company that, I get it, during COVID, when we were on the health committee here, everything was moving quickly at the very start, and things had to be done. But at the same time, there had to be some accountability of where that money was going. And somebody had to be accountable for signing those contracts and allowing those contracts to go through. And when we're talking in this government where there's policies that turn around and dictate what those levels are, they don't get signed off just by a simple, oh, here it is, and just go ahead and do it. Someone has to look at it. It's not just the minister that has to sign off on something over $100 million. There's deputy ministers. There are assistant deputy ministers that all have to look at that. And we're not talking one agency. We're talking not only the public works, we're talking other areas that we need to look at that are signing off in health, et cetera. So there's probably at least three at all three of those levels that had to look at this and say, we're going to sign off on this without even any recognition of what the end game is if it doesn't transpire. This motion is asking for these people to come and account for this for Canadians, so that the Canadian public has a true understanding of where that money was spent, whether it was spent wisely and appropriately, or whether it wasn't. And when we're signing for something, I don't know anybody in this room that would agree to have something purchased and not make certain that A, they received the product, and B, that if they weren't going to receive the product, that they were going to get their money back before it happened. My wife and I are looking at a new kitchen and and when I say new kitchen, as in a household kitchen,
Not a baby.
But when we're looking at that aspect of things,
You old dog.
the reality is we're not signing a piece of paper to say that I'm paying for something until I know there's assurances that it's going to be done. And that's just a simple little aspect of Canadians. Every Canadian is looking at that, and they need to be responsible and understanding of that aspect of it. So when we have a contract that eventually gets terminated because of mutual consent between Medicago and it releases them from their obligations, how does that answer to the Canadian public? That's what this motion is about. This motion is there to try and move forward so that we're accountable for where this is. We turn around and we look and we see when we put this motion first forward to have the 1064. And at that time, We had support for that. We had the required number of people to agree to this. We had in the news where the NDP were turning around saying, yes, they want to know where this $150 million has been spent and what it's been spent on and being accountable for that money. You know, the member that's here at this table stood into the press and told them, yes, we need to be bringing this up, and these are issues that need to be brought forward. And so these are things that we need to do, that this committee needs to turn around and say, this is something that's urgent, that needs to be brought to the fore, and we need to be doing it as soon as possible. And so I ask colleagues to look at this and support this motion such that we get on this as quickly as possible. With that, Mr. Chair, I will cede the floor, potentially coming back later.
Thank you, Dr. Kitchen. Mr. Doherty, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for the committee's sake and those that are listening in, I want to read back into the record the motion that given the recent media reports that the Public Health Agency of Canada lost over $300 million on an unfulfilled contract, the committee undertake a study of the Public Health Agency of Canada losing over $300 million in taxpayers' money for an unfulfilled contract. The committee hold at least 6 hours of meetings on this matter, and that each current meeting of the Health Committee is expanded by 1 hour to address this matter, and that the committee hear from the Minister of Health, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada, the President of the Treasury Board, and officials from Health Ministry and other witnesses deemed relevant by the committee, and that the hearings begin at the next available meeting, and the committee produce a report on its findings and report it to the House. Mr. Speaker, this is shocking. Again, now we're finding out. I mean, I guess it's really not new news. It kind of goes along the lines of same old, same old. You know, just going down the list of scandals and wasteful spending, $54 million on our ArriveCan app. McKinsey Consultants, $116 million. That was $116 million towards our opioid epidemic, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Chair, sorry. Bonuses to CMHC, $26.8 million to CMHC employees. Mr. Trudeau's London hotel, or Prime Minister Trudeau's London hotel room, $30,000 total booked September 15th to the 20th, $6,000 per night. COVID program abuse, $4.6 billion. Payments to Beijing-controlled Asia Infrastructure Bank, $210 million. The Trans Mountain Pipeline cost overruns, $30.9 billion. Renovations to Heritage Lake Cottage, $8.6. MasterCard, $50 million. Loblaws, $12 million. $12 million for freezers, which, Mr. Chair, I will offer, and I've said this a number of times, that was for the 2017, around about the 2017 wildfires, which thousands of my residents, residents in my riding of Caribou Prince George, were devastated by the 2017 wildfires, lost everything, lost fridges, lost stoves, lost all household belongings. Did they get money for replacement of their equipment? No, but Justin Trudeau gave $12 million to his friends at Loblaws, and now is claiming that he called them to Ottawa and laid down the law. We'll see how, and we saw how that went. Stop, or I'll say stop again, type thing. The new passport, changes to our new passport. Over $400 million to change our passport to some woke crap. Mr. Chair, this is just an egregious waste of taxpayer dollars. You know, if I buy a service from a contractor, if I pay for a contractor service, and yet I don't get the service that I need, I have the option to get my money. You should have the option to get your money back. You know, in October 23rd of 2020, the Prime Minister made this announcement. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, today announced an investment of up to $173 million through the Strategic Innovation Fund, the SIF, in Quebec City-based Medicago to support Canada's response to COVID-19. $173 million. The project, valued at a total of $428 million, would advance Medicago's virus-like particle vaccine development on the company's unique plant-based production platform through clinical trials. It will also establish a large-scale vaccine and antibody production facility to increase Canada's domestic biomanufacturing capacity. Mr. Speaker, who is Medicago? And who are they to the Liberal Party? I can tell you this, that they rank enough that they got into, the 2021 Liberal Party's platform right here, forward for everyone. And I turn the reader's attention to page 8. Here it is right here. And if you can see it, if anybody can see it. And it's on page 8 where it says, we have completed new biologics manufacturing center at the NRC, secured an agreement with Moderna to build a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility in Canada, and made major domestic capacity investments with Abcelera and Medicago. I mean, so big that they warranted getting a shout-out in and being promoted in the Liberal Party's 2021 campaign platform. And Mr. Speaker, that's just a cursory search. I'm sure when we do more digging, we're going to find either connections to the Trudeau Foundation or to Mr. Trudeau or Prime Minister Trudeau himself. This is shocking. You know, I fight day and night for investments in mental health. You know, the 2021. 2021, they also campaigned on a platform to make critical investments.
Excuse me, Mr. Doherty. A point of order from Mr. Joe Harry.
Can I ask my colleague, Mr. Doherty, don't bang on the table because it's going to, the interpreter are going to have a problem. And I know you're passionate about everything, and I just asked you.
I'll wave at the interpreters and apologize to them for that. But Mr. Speaker, it is so frustrating for me. How many beds for recovery could that money have built? You know, for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we've been pushing to do something in the about the opioid epidemic in this country. The hundreds of millions of dollars that this government has wastefully spent. How many vaccines were created? Not one. And where's this company now? Close the doors. Sunnier climes. Crazy that you give $173 million or more to a company that you get squat out of. What else did they get out of this? They must have got something. Was that a payoff for something? I mean, again, they're close enough to be listed in the Liberal Party's 2021 platform. Page 8 for those that are looking. This government is just not worth the cost. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Canadians got to wake up to this. It's not their money. You know, I bet you if you did a quick search that this was in some Liberal minister's riding. Well, I did the search. It was in the health minister's riding, Minister Duclos' riding. So $173 million that we know of, probably more, to a business that's no longer, the doors are shuttered. Doors, windows, everybody's gone. Sunnier climes, billionaire island, probably. $173 million. The billions of dollars. Former health minister gets it. Now the former Minister of Treasury as well, too. Minister of Treasury, the guy that controls the purse strings. This is crazy. You can't write this stuff. You couldn't make this stuff up. It's like a Hollywood movie. It's unbelievable. You know, in 2015, I campaigned in 2015, probably one of the most divisive things I've ever gone through. That and the nomination, of course. But in 2015, I remember this young guy that had great hair, rolled up his sleeves, and went all around our country saying that he promised to do government different. I believe his term was sunny ways. Said he's going to let the sunshine in. Sunshine's the best form of disinfectant. Promised not to use dilatory motions, omnibus bills, not use closure. Well, we know how that is. Promised to do things a lot differently. He was going to be, well, it was just, they were going to be different. They absolutely have been different. And our colleagues across the way, I say this all the time, I know there are good people across the way, and this has to be tough. I see the looks on their eyes when they sit in the back benches and they just roll their head when another scandal comes out. We, charity, S&C Lavalin. What about JWR, Jody Wilson-Raybould? The Elbowgate, Billionaire Island. Dividing Canadians, telling Canadians, why should we even tolerate these people? And I look at my colleagues across the way and I ask, is this leadership? And when the going gets tough and it's time to stand up and be counted, where is he? As you can see, I'm deeply frustrated, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to go over the list again. Elbowgate, Cash for Access, AgaCon, Cultural Appropriation, S&C Lavalin, election donation, blackface, We Charity, RCMP, interfering in RCMP investigations, ArriveCan app, Chinese interference. And I'll bring you back to one that I worked on, the clam scam, where another minister took millions upon millions of dollars and redirected them to his own family, his wife's cousin, and former Liberal colleagues. It's absolutely shameful. Shameful. And I hope my colleagues will see their way fit to vote in favor of this motion so we can, once and for all, get to the bottom of this wasteful spending scandal. It's unbelievable, Mr. Chair. With that, I'll cede the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty. Mr. Johari, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good that the election is in 2025, so my colleagues have a long runway to be able to get on the soapbox. Let's get back to the facts. I have fundamental issues with this 1064 motion for study, and it starts with the fact that it says in the recent media report, the Public Health Agency of Canada lost over $300 million. And I stop there. When we look at, and since our colleagues are constantly referring to the media, I'm going to go back to the media report that was out on November 3rd. And it clearly stated in a statement to National Post Friday, the press secretary of Health Minister Mark Holland, Chris Arn, said the government made a $150 million non-refundable advance payment to Quebec-based Medicago early in the pandemic to fund development and reserve a number of doses for its eventual COVID-19 vaccine. The advance purchase agreement was one of the 7 the government signed early in pandemic with vaccine manufacturer to secure vaccine doses as soon as they were ready at the time it was not known which, if any, of the vaccine would pass Health Canada approval process. Most of them did. So also I want to refer back to the note that was sent to the committee, signed by 5 of our colleagues across, stating that the government public health agency is unable to explain how the agency lost $150 million. So the fact is, the explanation is there. It was $150 million not lost, but invested into research and development. And it is not for an unfulfilled contract, because when you look at it, what was delivered was, and again, since our colleagues refer to media, I'd like to bring to the attention of our colleagues an article that dated February 24, 2022, that says Medicago plant-based COVID-19 vaccine is now approved by Health Canada, which will soon give Canadians the option of getting a homegrown shot against SARS-CoV-2. Now, my colleague across the aisle is bringing the Auditor General. I'd like to actually acknowledge that the Auditor General reviewed all the contracts and also confirmed that there was no issue with any of those contracts being executed. So it's not $300 million. It's 2 investments, one for $150 million for research and development, which resulted. Dr. Ellis, would you like me to do exactly the same thing to you when you have the floor by laughing at you?
If it's funny, you can.
It's not funny, it's fact. It's fact.
You're saying it's okay they lost 150
Mr.
million?
Chair.
No, I'm not saying it was, I'm saying it was not lost.
Dr. Ellis, Mr. Joe Harry has the floor.
So after refusing,
He has the floor, and everyone listened patiently and attentively when you had the floor. Please offer the same courtesy.
Who's
so
addressing me?
$150 million is not lost. Okay, it resulted in an approved vaccine by Health Canada. Now, what happened subsequently is of interest. So, again, since my colleagues like to refer to the media reports, I like to quote February 2nd, 2023 report from CBC. In March, the World Health Organization decided not to accept Medicago's COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use, citing the company ties to a big tobacco Marlboro cigarette manufacturer. Philip Morris International was once a shareholder of Medicago, but divested all its shares in late 2022. So, can the $150 million be accounted for? Yes. What was it invested in? R&D. Did the R&D result in a vaccine being developed, which was approved by Health Canada? Yes. Did the business go forward? No. Why? Because World Health Organization didn't approve it because of ties to a tobacco organization. Now, which meant that the product that's been manufactured, the vaccine that's been manufactured, is available domestically, but not internationally. Therefore, a business decision by Medicago and Mitsubishi, which is worthy of probably a study. Now we come into the other part of this. There was $173 million invested also in Medicago after the approval of the vaccine by Health Canada for the site expansion. It is worthy of study to see whether that $170 million actually went to the site expansion, and what is the status of that site expansion. So when we look at this motion and it's talking about lost rather than a business loss, that raises question. When we see unfulfilled contracts, there is ground for us to be able to see whether the contract was fulfilled or not, and the AG has done that. Whether it's $300 million, it's not. And also, the Public Accounts Committee is actually doing this study. So the notion of this study as is not acceptable by our side, because based on referring to the media, there are areas that the media has not had an opportunity to explore and may potentially lead into misinformation. Now, I'm not going to make any comments on the other my colleagues who talked about many other items, which we will deal with in election in 2025. But I want to also close by saying that I believe this is another tactic by our conservative colleagues across to delay the study of the women's health. Today, we're supposed to start the study of the women's health. We have children's health report that is not completed. We have breast implant report that is due for its second version for us to be able to finalize with some very good recommendation. We have PMP, PRB that it's now going to get pushed back. We have PPE study, and we know what happened to the fate of C-293. So, Mr. Chair, there are areas of concern in this motion, and I'd like to actually look at a modified or amended version of this motion, and for us to be able to bring total clarity to this, to the issue of where was the $150 million spent, because we know who spent it and what it was spent, and the state of the $170 million site expansion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Johari. Dr. Hanley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, delay. That's what I'm hearing from our conservative colleagues across the way. Just one meeting ago, we were hearing how urgent it was that we speak to the opioid crisis in Canada, with several hastily constructed motions in that regard. And suddenly it appears that that's no longer urgent. That's no longer an urgent issue. And you know, this is in my mind where we wanted to bring this committee to look at the study that is already in the queue on women's health, a study of deep concern to all of us and to Canadians, and then to proceed to the opioid crisis study, which was moved by myself some time ago, and we have been waiting to proceed to that study so we can make some new and informed recommendations for how much and how well and how much more we need to do to address the crisis that is killing 20 Canadians a day. So here we are now with a conservative revisionist history and delay and smoke and mirrors, and pushing for accountability on a non-issue. So two important points to make, and I know my colleague, Mr. Johari, has made those points, but I think it's worth reiterating. There is no lost money. The $150 million is money that was part of Canada's vaccine acquisition strategy in advance purchase agreements. There has also already been full transparency with these contracts, with the Auditor General and with the Public Accounts Committee. Parliamentarians from all parties have reviewed these contracts. So the money spent, the $150 million, was part of a highly successful strategy to actually lead us to deliver vaccines and save thousands of lives of Canadians. A strategy that led to Canada's vaccine rollout being one of the most successful on the planet. So what happened in the end is we did not see a vaccine produced and ready to go from the company in question, Medicago. And yes, that's unfortunate. But $150 million, as my colleague said, was spent on research and development and infrastructure development in Canada. More importantly, at the time, of course, nobody had the ability to know in advance which contracts were going to result in vaccines ultimately being delivered into people. Obviously, if we had that ability to predict the future, then we would be in a much better place from all kinds of points of view. You make decisions at the time based on best estimates of success, and advance purchase agreements, contracts were made with vetted companies through vetted contracts. Certainly in my previous role as Chief Medical Officer of Health in the Yukon during the pandemic, seeing Canada come through with vaccines, well, it was literally a lifesaver for my citizens of the Yukon, but for Canadians around the country. It was welcome relief. So accountability is fully there. Accountability is there to the point that the Auditor General has reported on and improved the process. And I can quote the Auditor General's finding: "We found that, although a non-competitive approach was taken, Public Services and Procurement Canada exercised due diligence on the 7 vaccine companies by conducting assessments to examine the company's financial capability to meet requirements and by conducting integrity checks to mitigate the risk of unethical business practices. We found no issue with the delegation of authority because the Minister of Public Services and Procurement signed the 7 advance purchase agreements." So, Mr. Chair, if we reflect back to that time, not that long ago, just over a couple of years ago, at the time this very committee was meeting in February 2021, and what were our Conservative colleagues saying then? Statement after statement urging the government to step up in vaccine acquisition. Statements such as, "This is a question the government cannot answer. It has not received enough supply to deal with this question. That is why it is so imperative for the government to get us more vaccines." Statement after statement urging Canada to step up and acquire vaccines. So again, this, as outlined by the Auditor General, this was a way for this was Canada's role and was verified through the Auditor General's approval that this was one of the 7 vaccine companies that was selected based on financial capability, integrity checks, and the viability of the company. So once again, we are using committee time to address issues that have that are spurious and are delaying the earnest work that we are all waiting to proceed on behalf of Canadians. Now, given that there is a need for information onto as to some of the details of the contract, which are not at the moment at the disposition of this committee, then I would be willing to support, and I think my colleagues would be willing to support some amendments to this motion. And what I therefore propose is an amendment. And the wording of the amendment would be that we delete everything after the first the committee, so that's the third line, and replace it with hold 4 hours of meetings on the government's advance purchase agreement for vaccines with Medicago, and invite officials from the Public Health Agency of Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada, the Auditor General, and Medicago. And I think that would fulfill some of the unanswered questions that members have brought forward, but allow us to proceed with the most efficiency possible in order to get onto some of the urgent committee business that my colleagues have also expressed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The amendment is in order, and the debate is now on the amendment. Mr. Davies, please.
Well, thank you. A lot's been said at this. I do have, I suppose, the privilege and the advantage of having served on this committee since 2015, and I sat through I was on this committee when we first heard the words COVID-19 back in the early days of 2020. And so I want to just put a little bit of context to the motion and history. At that time, I, as NDP health critic, worked very closely with the Conservative health critic, Michelle Rumpel-Garner, and we worked very closely, both parties in tandem, very strongly on the concepts of transparency and accountability. I think Dr. Kitchen was there with us at that time on the Conservatives, so he would remember that. And I think Mr. Theriault as well. And actually, the bloc, I think, participated.
Sorry, point of order, Chair, if I may.
Point of order, Dr. Ellis.
Or maybe just needs clarification, because I was actually part of the PAC-P committee who looked at these documents. There were significant non-disclosure agreements around it, and I'm just wondering if that's going to play into the utility of Dr. Handley's motion. Are we actually going to be able to examine these contracts, and are they actually going to be? Are we going to have in-camera meetings? Are they going to be in public? Because I certainly think that this is an issue that the public wants to know the answer.
But it is something that would be entirely appropriate for you to raise when you get the floor 3 speakers from now, because it is relevant to the discussion, but it certainly isn't relevant to any point of order. Go ahead, Mr. Davies.
Thank you. So at that time, the NDP and the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives joined together to demand transparency and accountability from the government in all aspects of the way that it handled the COVID-19 issue. And that included demanding all documents, including contracts with vaccine manufacturers at that time. And we were successful, actually. Partially, I should say. I mean, we got a procedure, a motion passed this committee that required the government to send all documents to the clerk of the House of Commons, the law clerk, who would then vet those documents for a couple of key factors, including national security interests and legitimate commercial confidentiality issues, and then provide those documents to the committee. And we did get a number of documents coming here. So I just want to remind all committee members, including those that were speaking today that weren't here at the time, who may have forgotten that the NDP played a key role in that transparency and accountability, because we believe that Canadians have a right to know how their government is spending their money. And frankly, given that it was the biggest pandemic in a century, we felt that it was important that Canadians have a first-hand look at how their government was responding to that pandemic. And even though there may have been some small reservations for true commercial confidentiality considerations and maybe some national security, we felt that the government was not being anywhere close to as forthright as they ought to have been, and that's the record of the NDP on this issue. I'm going to get to this in a moment because there's been a few inaccuracies that have been stated this morning that really need to be cleared up at this committee in that regard. Now, in this respect, we do know that the government did contract with a number of potential vaccine manufacturers, and one of them was Medicago. And we also know, we knew this before, we knew before this, the meeting today, we knew before this motion, that the reason that the contract with Medicago never panned out and that the contract was canceled even before it even got off the ground was after the World Health Organization refused to accept its vaccine for emergency use in 2022 because it was partly owned by tobacco giant Philip Morris International. Now, the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which Canada is a signatory to, contains clear directions stating that signatories should avoid all operations that would in effect give a positive impression of big tobacco in the public health. And second, it contains guidelines for implementing the treaty that state that governments should not, quote, accept, support, or endorse partnerships with tobacco companies or, quote, any entity or person working to further that, end quote. Now, that's the crux of the matter here. Now, there's some very important questions that arise from that, and that's why I support, as I've said publicly and as I'll say here today, I support very much the sentiment behind this motion here today. Was that fact that Medicago had commercial relations and an ownership relationship with Philip Morris International, was that disclosed to the Canadian government? Was it known? If it was known, then why was the contract signed by this government? Why would the government go ahead and sign a contract with a company that it knew had associations with big tobacco when it was also signatory to a convention where they agreed to do precisely the opposite of that? If the government, if they did know and they signed a contract, why was there no escape clause in the contract with Medicago that would indicate that if it turned out that Medicago or any other commercial vendor for that matter was in breach of a significant policy or issue, that the government would have had the ability to cancel the contract on that ground? Was there such a clause? If not, why wasn't there such a clause? If the government did not know that Medicago was involved with Philip Morris, how was that missed? These are all extremely important questions because the NDP agrees very much that giving $150 million away to a corporation and getting nothing in return is bad governance, and it cannot happen, and we need to get to the bottom of it. Even worse, what ended up happening here, if you think about it, is the taxpayers of this country and the government of Canada gave $150 million to a company that's associated with big tobacco for nothing. That is a gross violation of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So I'm very much in favor of getting to the bottom of it. Now, I've already mentioned that the government was very reluctant to be wholly transparent and accountability throughout the COVID pandemic. They resisted the opposition's attempt to have them disclose documents. We had to bring motions to force them to do that. And frankly, even when they did produce documents, most of the documents that were presented came slowly, and most of the documents were of a very standard form, like press releases and speaking notes and such. And it took a long time to get any real document of any value, and even then we got very few. That's why, by the way, the NDP moved an amendment at this committee just weeks ago to have a full public independent COVID inquiry that would look at every issue of the way this government handled it. And I want to point out only two parties supported that, the Bloc Québécois and the NDP. And the Conservatives, who now claim to want to get to the bottom of this matter, sat on their hands They abstained on a motion that if they had voted for it, we would have had a majority, and we would be well on our way to amending legislation that would be tabled in the House of Commons that would create an independent public COVID inquiry under the Inquiries Act, led by a judge with powers of subpoena, with the power to compel attendance of witness and documents, conducted in public on every issue, mandates, masking, vaccine contracts, everything. And the Conservatives, in the height of hypocrisy, did not support that. And here they are 2 weeks later, waxing eloquent, at least in their minds, pretending that they want to get to the bottom of this matter and grandstanding on a contract that, by the way, we kind of already know the answers now. Now, I want to stop and say, the response of the Public Health Agency of Canada when the National Post began asking questions to them about this $150 million loss to a, quote, unfulfilled contract by a vendor, close the quote, is absolutely unacceptable in a modern democracy. What did the Public Health Agency say? They refused to disclose any information whatsoever on the loss, such as the identity of the vendor, the nature of the deal, or even the product or service that wasn't received. Now that is shocking, it's unacceptable. That's not protecting commercial confidentiality, that's avoiding public accountability. Surely, Canadians have a right to know, and PHAC easily could have said, well, it was the Medicago contract, it had to do with vaccines. The nature of the deal was we procured vaccines from them, and we never did receive the vaccines, and they could even have said the reason why. What commercial confidentiality is being involved there? Nothing. We knew Medicago had a contract. We knew that the contract was canceled. We knew that it was because of their affiliation with Philip Morris. And yet here they are, last week, a Public Health Agency of Canada not telling a reporter or journalist or this committee anything at all about $150 million. And I agree with my Conservative colleagues and Dr. Kitchen. Frankly, I think most Canadians, $150 is a lot of money. $150 million is a substantial amount of money. Now, I want to pause and say a few things now about, so I very much support this motion and having meetings to call the Public Health Agency on the carpet here and get them to explain details of how this happened. Clearly, someone made decisions that were wrong and bad, and it resulted in a significant loss to taxpayers. And we have an obligation as parliamentarians to get to the bottom of it. Someone told me a long time ago when I was first elected that, I don't know if this is true or not, but he said that the number one duty of parliamentarians, why we're elected here, our first duty is to serve as a scrutineer of executive spending. That is actually the duty of parliamentarians of all parties. And this is a classic example of that. So I support the motion. By the way, I would have signed it had I been offered it. I was in the air at the time that when I landed in Vancouver on Thursday night and I saw this motion come forward. Now, there's a few things. Accountability and transparency are based on truth. And I see Conservatives nodding. So let's start telling some truth here, though, too. Because grandstanding and political myth-making and spreading misinformation, especially by people of a health committee in this time of health, I think is, well, frankly, it's appalling. The NDP
Point of order.
Liberal.
The title of the section is Losses of Public Money. That's not misinformation.
Oh, if my friend just waits a minute,
Point of order. Go ahead, Mr. Davies.
I'll very carefully detail the misinformation. Throughout Dr. Ellis's comments, I think even repeated by Dr. Kitchen, and frankly, Dr. Kitchen was at this committee, so he should know better. At the time these contracts were let, the NDP was not in any kind of agreement with the government whatsoever. The NDP signed a confidence and supply agreement in March of 2022. So when Dr. Ellis repeatedly states that the NDP Liberal coalition was in any way responsible for losing $150 million, that is just simply false. By the way, it's also not a coalition, but I'm prepared to let that go. I mean, you'd think as parliamentarians they'd understand basic terms like what a coalition and what one isn't. But I guess it makes better sound bites, the Conservatives, to say NDP Liberal coalition, even though there isn't one. It's a confidence supply agreement. And the NDP has no ability to influence government decisions or government spending in any way other than within the confines of the confidence supply agreement. And even then, it is a government decision. But the Conservatives know that. They just don't care. I do think, though, that while it may suit their temporal political benefits for the moment, I just want them to be aware of the long-term damage that they do to democracy in this country by spreading misinformation and confusing Canadians about the way politics works at this committee. So back in 2021, when this government was letting these contracts, the NDP had zero to do with this government, and that needs to be clear. And I would hope and ask my Conservative colleagues to at least have enough respect for the truth that they can continue, that they will discontinue that kind of misinformation misleading Canadians.
Point of order from Dr. Ellis.
I guess, someone brought up relevance before, but realistically, looking at relevance, this motion doesn't mention the NDP at all. This member continues to talk about and wax on about the NDP. Maybe you could bring it back to the center again. Thank you.
I hear Mr. Davies responding to points that were raised in your intervention.
I mean, this is the kind of
point of order, Mr. Chair.
A point of order from Mr. Fisher.
I was going to say the exact same thing. I hear Mr. Davies speaking on all the things that have been said today. But what I would say is, if possible, when the Conservatives were speaking, we were utterly quiet, including Mr. Davies. And now there's chuckles, there's giggles, so I would just suggest, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, if we could all just listen to whoever's doing the debating and whoever's making their important points, if we could all...
Okay.
I can't even get out my point of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Davies. And I acknowledge Mr. Fisher's comment with respect to one person only having the floor, and it is Mr. Davies. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I mean, this is the kind of absurdity that that the Conservative position is being reduced to, where Dr. Ellis talks repeatedly about the NDP and the NDP Liberal Coalition in his remarks, and then when I respond to him, he says he thinks that it's inappropriate for me to mention the NDP after he's mentioned it 22 times in his talks. I mean, with that kind of lack of good faith of this committee, it makes one wonder how far we're going to get in this. And by the way, I also just want to say that the Conservatives brought up, I think it was Dr. Kitchen, the very real point that Canada was left in a position where we couldn't produce vaccines. I think it's important for all Canadians to know why that's the case. It's because the Conservatives, under the leadership of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, sold Canada's Crown Corporation, Connaught Labs, which had been producing vaccines and other medications in this country. And had that decision not been made, Canada could very well have been in a position to produce vaccines, and maybe we wouldn't have had to rely on companies like Medicago or other companies. But of course, we were placed in that position of vulnerability because of bad, poor policy decisions by the Conservatives back then, and Canadians need to know that as well. The situation that Canada found itself in 2020, early 2020, was a bad one. We were unprepared. We had poor personal protective equipment. We were unable to produce vaccines. And all of that is shared by consecutive Conservative and Liberal governments who came before them, as documented in repeated Auditor General reports going back decades. So lest the Conservatives get completely sanctimonious, I'd like to, they claim to be the party of accountability and responsibility. They sure don't take it when there's any placed on their lap. So where I would like to end here is saying that I think we should look at this issue. I do appreciate that this motion does tack on the meetings in addition, an extra hour after regular meetings. And I want to second what my colleagues at Liberal said and point this out as well. I've been on committees a long time, and I'll tell you, every party can throw a monkey wrench into the machinery. For every action of dislocation and confusion and delay that can be thrown into this, there's an equal one. By the way, I would also say the Conservatives who have pretensions of being government next time, they can maybe want to file away this point for their government because they may face this as well. I have found that at committees, we have to work together to some degree. Every party at this table sat down and agreed in a subcommittee meeting of the agenda and then in open committee as to what the agenda of this committee would be. And then one party has taken it upon themselves, the Conservatives, to then, after they've agreed to that, come forward and continue to disrupt the agenda that they themselves agreed to. Now, they can continue doing that, I suppose, but there are countermeasures that can happen. And then you know what happens? Canadians suffer. The very real business. You know, the Liberals had a study on the human resources the health professionals' human resources crisis. The Conservatives had their study on children's health. The Bloc has had its study on the breast implant registry. We have not even completed the children's study report yet, nor have we completed the very important report on the breast implant registry. And I've been waiting patiently. I'm now into the third year of this committee, waiting for the first NDP study on women's health that for some reason the Conservatives appear not to want to get to, for some reason. But I hope that's not the case. And so what I would say is this, and speaking to the amendment, I think this motion is sound. I think it's well-founded. I want to thank the Conservatives for moving it. But I don't think that we necessarily need 6 hours of meetings on this matter, which is the equivalent of 3 meetings. So far, the Women's Health Committee, if we ever get to it, is between 6 and 7 meetings. Are we really saying that we need 3 meetings to discuss this matter when we already know the basics of it? And yet we're going to spend 1 meeting on, or 2 meetings on women and cancer? Really? That's how the Conservatives would allocate the time of this committee? I would say that this motion, and I'm not sure if I can make a sub-amendment, Mr. Chair, but I might say that this motion should say that, I would amend it to say that the committee hold up to 6 hours of meetings. And that way we can gauge, we can get the answers that we need. If I'm wrong and it takes 6 hours of meetings to get the answers to the questions that we need, so be it. But if we get that answer in 2 meetings or 2 hours or in 3 hours, then that will save all of us to be able to focus on the times. And I want to say this. I want to give my Conservative colleagues one bit of credit. I want to ask and hope and give them the credit that they are interested in women's health. Mr. Doherty is often very good at giving credit to everybody. I want to assume that all of us want to get to that. I was going to say as well that in terms of a 106 meeting, I'm not sure. 106 meetings are generally reserved for emergencies. I'm not really sure that this topic, important as it is, constitutes an emergency. But because I appreciate the Conservatives tacking on the extra hour, then I think we can look at this issue without disrupting the regular agenda. And I would implore all of my colleagues at this table to let's get back and respect the agenda that we've agreed to. And we can tack on this subject. I would agree to support this and tack this on an hour after each meeting, up to 6 hours until we're satisfied that we get answers that we need. I'm just going to check my notes. Yes, and so I would, the last thing I'll say is, you know, it would be nice if we could get to a vote on this. I think that the issue's been well canvassed. I think we've heard from all sides. We've heard 4 Conservatives speak. We've had 2 Liberals speak, although Mr. Theriault, I don't want to take away his ability to speak. So after we hear from Mr. Theriault, I'm hoping that we can vote on this. But I would move that we a sub-amendment that to the main motion that we just change the words up to in front of 6 hours.
Mr. Davies, you can't move a sub-amendment to the main motion because there is an amendment under discussion. You can move a sub-amendment to the amendment, but
Well,
not
could I
to the
move a
main motion.
sub-amendment to delete the sub-amendment and instead replace the main amendment with the words up to in front of 6 hours?
So I'm advised that that is also not in order, that if you don't like the amendment, the right way to go about it is to defeat it, and then the main motion can be amended anew.
Okay. Could I ask for unanimous consent? If we're going to get, I mean, if there's opposition, fair enough, but if everybody agrees to get to that, could we ask for unanimous consent to that, if that would provide a motion that everybody can live with?
So I think there's a request for unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment and to replace it with what Mr. Davies is putting forward. Is there unanimous consent to proceed in that fashion? I don't see unanimous consent. So that then brings us, are you ceding the floor, Mr. Davies?
I'm ceding the floor, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Dr. Pelosi, please.
Yeah, finally, I've been frustrating listening to all this conversation. We are the health committee, and yet we've heard about everything, especially from the Conservatives, other than health. We heard about We Charity, SNC Lavalin, billion-dollar islands. We even heard about Mr. Kitchen's Kitchen, the cost of housing. But I would implore the committee to get back to health. I mean, that's what we're here for. I think and I've been on this committee for 4 years, I think compared to a lot of committees, we've actually done a pretty good job in being nonpartisan when we had to be nonpartisan. For example, the workforce shortage study, I think we came up with some good recommendations that, in fact, I think the government has gone with a lot of those recommendations. I think the breast implant study, thanks to Mr. Theriault, was a real success too, and we were coming up with some recommendations if we ever get to them. Now, we have a couple studies that are in line for us to deal with the opioid crisis, which the Conservatives certainly agree is a crisis. I mean, here we're holding this emergency debate to deal with this issue that was basically before us 2 years ago. I feel like we're turning the clock back. I know Mr. Davies was here. I know Mr. Kitchen was here. I know Sonia was here. Daryl was here when we dealt with this 2 years ago under COVID, when there was the question of revealing the contracts with the vaccine manufacturers. We dealt with all that 2 years ago, and here we are suddenly, this is a big emergency. Well, I would support the Conservative position to begin with, that the opioid crisis is far more of an emergency than this is. I also say that the women's study is more important than this, and as Dawn has said, I don't think the Health Committee has ever studied women's health before. So instead of doing all that, we're going back and we're turning the clock back to this issue of what was in those contracts. So I reluctantly support the amendment to limit the debate, the number of sessions we're going to hold on it. But I really do think this is interrupting our doing far more serious work. And let me go to the actual issue of those contracts. So I, like some of the other people here, was on the COVID committee during the time of COVID. And for those who weren't there, let me tell you, when we first talked to scientists about how long it would take to get the vaccines, almost everybody was saying something like 5 years. A few people thought it might be as short as 2 years. However, the fact that we got the vaccines out as quickly as we did was a real accomplishment. And it was a real horse race back then. I mean, we were all globally looking for whoever could come up with the vaccines the fastest. And you know what? I was somebody who was critical of my own government at the time and the fact various things in response to COVID. But in terms of the vaccines and our ability to get the vaccines out, I think we did really well. And if you look at the ones we chose, we chose Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, yes, Medicago, but that was one of the many. And you know what? We hit the nail on the head with Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and we had advanced purchase agreements for those. And it served Canadians very well. And I think that our response, I think when we look back at it, our response to the COVID pandemic was pretty good. As for Medicago, yes, and to Don's point, my understanding is 21% of the ownership was Philip Morris. And I certainly understand WHO's position in not supporting anything done by big tobacco, but I'm not sure if the government even knew of a 21% ownership. And back at the height of COVID, I don't know how much that mattered, because if Medicago came up with a vaccine and was the quickest to produce the vaccine, are you going to tell me really that nobody would have accepted it because 21% ownership was with Medicago? And certainly, and I asked the Conservatives, the NDP, everyone else, like, who owns shares in Pfizer and Moderna? I mean, do we know? Have we looked into that? Would we not contract with those depending on who owned shares in that? So, yes, and $150 million, and in terms of accountability, $150 million is a lot of money. But hindsight is 2020. We didn't know who was going to win the horse race and who was going to be the first to produce the vaccines. So I think it was a sound policy decision for the government to not put all its eggs in one basket, to not just invest in one vaccine manufacturer, to invest in a number of vaccine manufacturers. And that's what we did. And so, yes, I mean, everyone wasn't going to win this race. And so some of the companies we invested in turned out they didn't. Now, as it turns out, Medicago, for $150 million, did do the work. They did produce a vaccine. So the money wasn't really wasted per se. And as for looking into it, and as for transparency, my understanding is the Public Accounts Committee has looked at those contracts and is continuing to look at those contracts. The Auditor General has looked at those contracts. We ourselves, and Don will remember, and he was part of that motion to procure all relevant documents related to the contracts with vaccine manufacturers. We fought this battle 2 years ago, and those contracts were revealed. So it is not as though there's been no transparency on this issue. And for us to spend another 2 or 3 sessions on this, rather than dealing with the opioid crisis, rather than dealing with women's health, I think is wrong. And I think it's unfortunate that yet again the Conservatives seem to want to impede our ability to actually deal with the real issues we ought to be dealing with. And I would urge everyone on the committee, we are the health committee. We should be looking after the health of Canadians and not wasting our time. And yes, it isn't a waste of our time, but as and I'm sure Dr. Ellis will realize in medicine, you have to triage things according to importance. And really, we're going to put this in front of, for example, the opioid crisis. I don't agree with that. But be that as may, if we can confine it to as few sessions as possible, I'm in favor of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pawlowski. Dr. Ellis, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and interesting. I'll try not to inflame the situation anymore. I know people are obviously very sensitive of this topic, and as well they should be, with $300 million in Canadian taxpayer money. Anyway, that being said, I'd like to propose a sub-amendment that would also suggest that the Conservatives are quite happy to say up to 4 hours of meetings, but the Minister of Health needs to be included as one of the witnesses. So happy with Dr. Hanley's motions, but changing it to up to 4 hours with the Minister of Health being one of the witnesses. Thank you.
Okay, so
Point of order, Mr. Chair?
May I have a point of order, Mr. Davies, yes.
I think would help all of our committee members. We're wondering because the main conservative motion says to add an hour to regular meetings, which again, I think is a good idea, we're not sure if that can be done or not. Does the committee have the resources to add an hour tack on to meetings? Because I think that would help all of us make our minds up about which way we go. If it turns out that we can do that, or if we can't, it makes a difference.
Okay, so first of all, the amendment removes that add the extra hour, so that isn't what's under debate right now, but I think you're asking for some advice from the clerk as to whether if we defeat the amendment and come back to the original motion, whether it's doable from an administrative perspective.
So we can look into it and get back to the committee. But
And the answer is we don't have an answer now, but it is something that we can look into and get back. At this point, we don't know. It isn't an unreasonable request, but that doesn't mean it's going to be granted. I do have Mr. Terrio on the list, but I just want to get clear on the sub-amendment before we get there. So the speakers list, and I want to clarify something in connection with the sub-amendment, but the speakers list is Ms. Sidhu, Mr. Terrio, and Mr. Fisher at this point. With respect to the sub-amendment, Dr. Ellis, I believe that there are two things that you want to amend on the amendment. So one is that the amendment calls for 4 hours of meetings. You want to insert the words up to. And on the list of witnesses that is contained in the amendment, you want to add the Minister of Health. Do I have it right?
That is correct, Chair.
Okay. The sub-amendment is in order. The debate is on the sub-amendment, and Ms. Sidhu has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I want to speak on the main whole process today, but I support Dr. Hanley's amendment, and which we are just now agreeing on. And Mr. Chair, I'm disappointed today. Really want to say my all colleagues, I'm really, really disappointed today. And Mr. Chair, this motion today, which we are looking into, was brought forward through an urgent measure 106.4, which we are discussing today. Just like Mr. Davis, I have served on this committee from 2015. This standing order only used to bring experts on emergency issues, which we heard from experts in 2021, in 2020, and we had this motion triggered for emergencies for long term, an issue that was, I speak on, which I know Mr. Davis, many of us on that time, COVID time. Today's matter in front of another committee, the Public Accounts Committee. Yes, accountability, transparency is important. And it is full transparency when the agreement and other, happened. Like when this issue is in front of Public Account Committee and unredacted document due to significant confidentiality procedures to protect commercial sensitivities. Today's matter has already been examined by the Auditor General too. Another committee is working on this with more resources, with more information. And this committee, when my 5 colleagues from the other side, and I'm the only woman in this health committee. And today we were discussing on a women health study, which we are not. And it is important for me and for many women, this is important. And you know that, Mr. Chair, on the last Saturday, when I was meeting with many women, they said, oh, you are doing the study on the women's issue, women health study. And women health study we are doing. And a tweet has gone viral over the weekend. This is the women's study is not happening today, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Mr. Davies to bringing this women's study, which I was waiting from long time. And this is not happening today. And this is not right. And that's why I'm disappointed, Mr. Chair. And I understand that accountability, transparency is important. But when other committees are looking into that, and this is a health committee, we should study on women's health. And I'm the only woman, and I was waiting from long time. That is why, and it's not happening today. It is so sad. And Canadians expect us to do good things, not the we are just doing here and making clips. And there's another time to make all these clips. But let's do work which Canadians expect us to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Sidhu. Mr. Thériault, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, bon.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've been patient. I've listened to my colleagues. When I signed the 164 letter on November 2, for a week, that the parliamentary budget officer and the press were trying to get responses. And there we have a 1064, and then the next day the minister starts to provide some information. So how can we go from an institution like the PBO? And I completely respect our institutions. Why? Because they are the guarantee of the good functioning of democracy. It's not a partisan issue. It's not an issue of savoir, of knowing whose was it a Quebec business or not, and it's not an issue of trying to find out whether. I'm sorry, Mr. Thériault, but the clock is running. So I'm not saved by the clock. Sorry, the bells are ringing.
We therefore require the unanimous consent of the committee to continue the meeting. Do we have unanimous consent to continue the meeting until, say, 10 to 2? Did you want to speak to that, or are you saying yes? Okay. Do we have unanimous consent to continue until 1:50? We do. Or wait a second. 1:50. We have a meeting until 1. Did I say 1:50? Yes. Sorry. It'd be for another 20 minutes, I guess, is what I'm asking for, so that we can deal with this if possible. Do we have unanimous consent to continue for 20 minutes? Okay. We do not have unanimous consent? All right. I am therefore obliged to suspend the meeting, colleagues. It is quite clear that there is a willingness to continue this discussion. There are two ways that this can be done. One is to suspend this meeting, which means that the next time we come together, we'll pick up where we left off. The other is to adjourn the meeting and move to resume debate. Is there? Okay. All right.
The committee could agree right now.
The committee can agree now to resume debate on Wednesday. Is that?
Adjourn?
Okay. So we can do that and adjourn. It would simply require us to amend the notice of meeting for the next meeting. The effect is the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Therefore, the meeting is adjourned. Wednesday's meeting will be dedicated to a resumption of this topic.